I'm Lauren Apter-Bairnsfather. I'm director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. The Holocaust Center connects the horrors of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism with injustices of today. Through education, we empower individuals to build a more civil and humane society. And I can't thank you enough for joining us for our commemoration of the 83rd anniversary of the November 1938 pogrom, which most people know of as Kristallnacht. 2 days of violence that spread across Germany, Austria, and part of Czechoslovakia, an event that preceded flight of thousands of Jewish refugees across the globe, seeking refuge wherever they would be accepted. And tonight we will hear the story of Jewish refugees in Shanghai, which is providing the larger context for sharing a very special artifact, which you all just saw a little bit more about. And it's an artifact that is in the permanent collection of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. Every year, we are so grateful to Edgar Snyder for supporting our Kristallnacht Commemoration. I would also like to thank our Life and Legacy funders, whose contributions will keep the work of the center alive well into the future. And I invite you to visit our website, www.hcpgh.org, to learn more about ways that you too can support our work for years to come. Our guests of honor tonight are the Weinblum family, whose story is shared this evening, and whose dedication over the years has kept a precious artifact safe to be shared with future generations. I would also like to thank WQED, who has allowed us to share Harbor from the Holocaust exclusively with our audience for a limited time. So that was yesterday, and today it's still available. We're going to do a Q&A at the end of this program, and we're going to use the Q&A function in the Zoom. I will remind you all later. We have a few things to do before we get to that. And we are currently recording the program, and we will be able to share it at a later date through our YouTube channel. To begin the program, we're going to share a conversation that I had with Marilyn Weinblum, who was the daughter-in-law of Jakob Weinblum, who rescued the Torah after Kristallnacht. She tells us more about the Torah and about Jakob, whom she called Jack, and we're going to begin the program with this interview. Thank you again for being with us. Here with Marilyn Weinblum, who is going to share with us some more about Jakob Weinblum, who rescued and preserved the Torah that we are looking forward to displaying for the public soon. So Marilyn, thank you so much for being with us.
I'm happy to tell the story again.
Oh, so glad, and it'll mean so much to people. One of the things that the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh is really invested in is in keeping the stories of Holocaust survivors alive. And we do that often through conversations with children, children-in-law, grandchildren, and it's really wonderful that you're willing to do this. So thank you again. My first question is, can you tell us about Jakob as you remember him?
Sure. Jack, we called him Jack. Jack was very intelligent and he wanted to go to the university. But when he was in high school, the Nazis forbid Jews from going to school. So, of course, he had to quit. Jack was a Zionist, loved Israel, went there many, many times. Unfortunately, Jack died very young when he was 57 years old. And it was 2 months after he came in for the first dedication when Danny was only 6 months old and Amy was 2. So they really didn't get to know him. And I personally only knew him for 5 years.
And you're referring to your daughters, so Jack's granddaughters, Danny and Amy.
Yeah, granddaughters. He just really loved them and wanted to be a good grandfather. But he wasn't able to because he passed.
So when we think about Jack's decision to rescue the Torah, we have so many questions. And if you could, how did this 18-year-old have the presence of mind to rescue the Torah from the Nazis? And what made him decide, if you know this, what made him decide that of the few things that he could take with him when they fled to Shanghai, he would take this Torah?
Actually, Jack was only 17 on Kristallnacht, and they were burning all the synagogues and the stores and breaking all the windows. And he said he just ran out and he went into his synagogue and grabbed the Torah. And then well, I'll be telling you the part of the story later, but when it was time for them to leave, they were only allowed to take $4, which was 10 marks, and anything they could carry. And being that his parents were able to take a lot of their clothes and things, he just wanted to take the Torah because he didn't want the Germans to come in and burn it.
That is so incredible. And I know that among our viewers, we'll have a number of high school students. So it raises this question, 17 years old. And that was what mattered to him. That's what he wanted to take. Is so incredible. Did Jack and his family talk about their lives in Germany at all?
Actually, they didn't. And actually, when I grew up, when I was a teenager, nobody talked about the Holocaust. We had a lot of German Jews that came here and settled in McKeesport, but nobody talked about it. Not even when I was in Sunday school. And I did not really find out about the Holocaust till I was in college the first year. And when I came home, I was so shocked when I told my mother, how come nobody ever told me about this? She said people couldn't talk about it. But after Jack died, after the funeral, his wife took out a paper that he had written when he was 30. So I'm going to read to you what Jack said in his own words. This is what it's like 4 pages, but I only picked out a few of the things to read. In the end of October of 1938, all Polish Jews were arrested any way they were found, loaded on a train and transported to Poland. It was a horrible picture to see all those people without any of their belongings, some taken out of bed, some from the street, kids taken out of school, everybody banded together like a bunch of animals, none of them knowing what would happen to them. A few weeks later, on the early morning of November the 10th, all male Jews between 16 and 65 were arrested and brought to work camps. All property was confiscated, homes and stores destroyed. And what followed, that if I told people outside of Germany, they wouldn't believe it. I was released on December the 2nd with the order to get my family ready to leave up into not later than June the 15th, 1939. It was ridiculous to ask me, a 17-year-old boy, to arrange the immigration of a whole family, but I had to try. First, I had to see to it that my father was released from work camp. For that purpose, I needed a visa and a ship ticket, and now actually everything started, and then it stopped. He never finished it. But I know what happened. After that, he and his future wife, Paula, went up to the camp every morning at 6 in the morning on a train, trying to get both of their fathers out. And Jack's mother sold everything that she had because she really didn't think they were ever going to come back. And she was able to purchase tickets for the whole family to go on a ship that was the last ship that ever left Germany. And the only country that would take Germans without a passport was China. And off they went to Shanghai.
I'm really, first of all, that document exists is an incredible thing. And that you were able to fill in what happened after he stopped writing the story. Whew. Did they talk about the experience living in Shanghai at all?
Actually, no, only that they were very poor and that it was very hard for the men to find jobs. The women had no trouble because his wife, he got married when he got to China. His wife was a waitress and his mother was a seamstress, and she took in boarders. And as bad as things were, when the Japanese came into the war in 1941, they moved them all to even a worse ghetto. And they were there, I think, for 2 years. And then in 1945, the Allies came and they bombed, and they accidentally bombed the Jewish ghetto, and hundreds of Jews were killed. And Jack survived again with his whole family until they were able to leave China and then come to San Francisco with the Torah in a duffel bag. But when they got to New York and they went to the Orthodox synagogues, they didn't want it because they had to cut the dowels off, and some of the letters were dirty. And here he was, a poor refugee, no money at all, wanting to give them the Torah. And it stayed in his closet in New York for 26 years. But then when I told the story to Rabbi Rakoff, and he just couldn't believe it. And he said, I want to talk to your father-in-law the next time he comes into Pittsburgh. And when he told him the story, he said, I want that Torah and I want to put it in our ark. I want it to have a home. And that's where it stayed for 22 years. And every Simchas Torah, they took it. It was huge. I guess you saw how big it is.
Yes.
The younger guys could carry it. The older men couldn't carry it. But they opened it up and they used it for Simchas Torah.
That's such an important and interesting detail when we think about Jack at 17 years old deciding to carry it with him and carrying it to Shanghai and bringing it to San Francisco and across the United States, how large and heavy it is.
Yes.
This was, I mean, what a commitment he made to being sure that that was preserved, which is just an incredible story to come out of Kristallnacht. Just an incredible story.
And he never thought that it would find a home like it did, and that the Tree of Life Sephard in White Oak would have such a huge celebration and paraded through the shul under a canopy.
So can you tell me what the Torah means to you and to your family? Was it something that you discussed often prior to finding a home for it?
Actually not. I talked about it all the time. And I kept telling people, I wrote a story, The Journey of Jacob's Torah, but it really wasn't until we did the second dedication at the JCC that I told the story again about Rabbi Rakoff, and how he kept the Torah there for 22 years. And then, as you know, it was at the JCC for another 18 years, and thousands of people walked past and saw it. And underneath it, there was, my parents had bought a new cover for it, and it said, dedicated to my grandchildren, Amy and Danielle Weinblum. And so people would call me all the time and say, I saw your Torah, and I saw the story right next to it. So I was so proud that it was there. And we still have Weinblums that live in White Oak. Jack's brother, Ziggy, just died a few years ago, and everybody that came up to him, tears just came down from his eyes when they said, what a story your niece told us.
And I'm so glad that we're continuing that story and keeping it visible and making sure that thousands and thousands more people will be able to hear it and see the Torah again. And I can't help but mention that we have this connection too between McKeesport and White Oak. And I love to remember the vibrant Jewish community that was there and the Jewish community that's still there, and to recognize what an important thing it was to give a home to the Torah while it was sitting in New York without a place to go. So much about this story connects our hometown, connects the work of the Holocaust Center, reminds us of what a treasure our Holocaust survivors are and were while they were still living. Of course, we still have survivors with us. And it's just really a beautiful occasion to be able to talk about this and really to remember and honor Jack for rescuing this incredible artifact and making sure that we have it and we will always remember. Again, Marilyn, thank you. It was really just a joy to talk to you about this, to see you again, and to reconnect with Amy and Danielle. I hope we'll see you again soon too, and just to your family for being sure that this story remains present in our community. And we look forward to installing the exhibit. So as we say in that conversation, thousands more people can see the Torah. So now we're going to watch the 28-minute documentary, An Unlikely Refuge. And then after this, we'll be joined by Iris Samson, a local filmmaker and producer. And recently she won an Emmy for the film we're about to watch. So let's watch that now.
For Public Broadcasting. Additional support provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Philip Chosky Charitable and Educational Foundation, the Posner Foundation of Pittsburgh, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
My Uncle Hai was able to get a visa to go in what, in certain ways would be the most surprising direction.
In the early 1930s, as Hitler was coming to power, many German and Austrian Jews fled to Shanghai.
They rode out the war upwards of 6 or 7 years in Shanghai.
February 12th, 1941, I was born in Shanghai.
After 1938, after Kristallnacht, there were thousands and thousands of Jewish refugees who were attempting to flee Europe.
I'm 14 years old. It never occurred to me that my father had a story,
It was a sort of moment in time that opened and then quickly shut. But while it was open, Jews were able to pour in. Shanghai actually became a place of refuge. It was sort of a little wrinkle in time.
My name is Jakob Weinblum, and my family was from Germany. My dad had several brothers and sisters. My mother had another sister. Eventually, when the Holocaust came, some of them perished and some of us survived. Kristallnacht came around 1938. And after my dad was interned to Buchenwald, it was decided he had to get out of Germany as fast as he could. You had waiting lists to go to various countries. He had a ticket for United States or something, and it was a long number. He was able to trade his American tickets for Shanghai. And that's how we wound up in Shanghai. That was in '39.
Shanghai was an open city. You didn't need a visa to get into Shanghai. If you could get there by boat or by train, and you were in. You didn't have to show any papers or anything.
They had to go with whatever they had on their backs. Later on, it was worse for the refugees because they had nothing. Absolutely nothing. Nothing at all.
In order to conquer the world, we must first conquer China.
The Japanese began invading China in the 1930s, and they start in the north in Manchuria and gradually come closer and closer. And Shanghai is the prize. It's the wealthiest city of China.
Thousands and thousands of Chinese eventually died from execution, diseases, whatsoever. February 12th, 1941, I was born in Shanghai. There was a proclamation in 1943 in February, and they had to be in a certain area called the Hangkou section.
One reason the Jews are put in Hangkou is that it was the worst part of Shanghai. It was a poor community And then it had been bombed very heavily by the Japanese earlier in the 1930s.
It wasn't only 15,000 people that lived in Hankou. There were 100,000 people, which included some Japanese families and Chinese. So I remember going to school or synagogue to the Ohel Moshe, and I remember sometimes walking through bodies. I had to cross over dead bodies, and there were still people dying and starving, mainly Chinese, I believe. There were two big schools. The main one was Kaduri School. So the kids went to school, kindergarten, excursions, and etc. And in the evenings, I would be outside because it was so hot in the summer. And that's how I spent a lot of the time. I remember the monsoons, and sometimes we went to the youth center. Life went on. We had a lot of diseases. We had to worry about the malnutrition. So it was pretty bad because everything was, rationed. And eventually it got even worse a year later. You had to learn how to boil water. A lot of people didn't boil water and of course got real sick. We had tuberculosis, we had dysentery, malaria, name it. I eventually wound up having malaria. I was living, I believe, in the ghetto on Ward Street, Vatra. If I looked outside the window, about 100 feet across, the streets were real wide, I could see the courtyard and the big jail and possibly the hospital. Another thing I remember, there was another group housing which were called Heims, and these people were living like 200 or more in one area, one home. End of 44, maybe early 45, and we got some air raids. I lived right across, of course, the bomb shelter. I remember the first time going in, and I remember it was my last time because I think I got claustrophobia. So whenever there was an air raid, I'd hide. July 17, I would believe 1945, and the big raid, and I remember that day very well. I was in school, in one of the Kaduri school, and I guess it might have been elementary or something. I was about 5 at that time. Next thing I heard one of the bigger girls come running and said, "Harry, run, run." I heard the planes, I started running. As soon as I got out of the building, we were running, the explosion and debris went flying all over us. Miraculously, we just kept running. There were hundreds of people who were wounded and killed, and buildings burning, and the Japanese, Chinese, and the immigrants were helping the wounded. A few weeks later, something big happened in the world. The first bomb was on Hiroshima, second bomb was on Nagasaki. Actually, the war was over. Then came the soldiers. I remember them very well. The Americans, they were giving out Hershey bars. And they started getting the news about what was going on in Europe. Well, that hit them harder than while they were living in Shanghai, they couldn't believe it was worse. They found out how bad the Holocaust was, and they lost their relatives, etc. And that was the worst news they ever got. We were eventually sponsored to go to America, and we left in 1947, somewhere around June, I believe. We wound up in Cleveland. My mother, baby pictures. Okay, this is an album of me in Shanghai. Some of the pictures of my mother and I as a baby. I met my wife in Erie, and then she got a job here in Pittsburgh at the VA, and I followed her, and I stayed here since then. My parents, my dad, they never talked about World War I or Kristallnacht or World War II. Never. I think it changed their life completely. From something to nothing, and all the property being taken away, and the hate of the Germans on the Jews at that time. And I just feel that I'm lucky I survived it.
Why would some Chinese guy save a bunch of Austrian Jews? He really had no reason to. It's who he is. I am Feng Shanho's granddaughter. My father was his son. In 1938, after Anschluss, when the Nazis took over Vienna, he became the consul of the Chinese consulate. And at that time then, my grandfather was responsible for the Chinese consulate in Vienna. He understood very quickly that according to an agreement that was signed by all the countries, that there was a limitation to the number of Jews that the countries would accept. There was a quota, and he did not agree to this. He thought it was wrong. At the time, a lot of the Jews were lining up on the sidewalks, surrounding all the consulates. My grandfather then began to sign visas for anybody who wanted them.
The Germans allowed the Jews to leave Germany if they knew they had these visas, and he knew that not all the Jews would go to Shanghai. They just needed a visa to leave.
These actually were entry visas. Basically, it's just a stamp and a passport that enabled the Jews to get a train ticket or to get a bus ticket or a boat ticket or anything. It just proved that another country would take them in. And understandably, my grandfather realized that probably a great number of the Jews to whom he gave visas would not go to China because of the distance, but he also realized that with just this stamp, they were able to at least leave Nazi-occupied countries.
The whole reason that Shanghai was able to be the place in the world that was open and able to accept Jews was that within the chaos of the war within these two theaters, Europe and China, there was this small window of opportunity.
In 1937, Japan invaded Shanghai and took over the Chinese portions of the city. After 1938, after Kristallnacht, there were thousands and thousands of Jewish refugees who were attempting to flee Europe, and there weren't any ports open available for them. Shanghai was a port in which nobody was really paying attention.
Unfortunately, very few people did help the Jews, and diplomats were in a slightly different position because they could issue visas, but unfortunately, very few diplomats did. The character for Shanghai and his name. So here, this would have been, let's see.
I recognize his name.
We don't know the exact number of visas, but given the number on the visas that were discovered, it is speculated that he wrote well into the thousands. They were very unhappy with him, and he was sent from Vienna.
Why do you think Yeye never mentioned any of this while he was still alive?
I don't think my grandfather meant to keep it as a secret. It would have never occurred to him to talk about something like this because he just didn't think of it as anything spectacular, I think. He thought of it more as something, I think, that anybody should have done in his position.
That's kind of scary, isn't it? All you needed was a stamp and a passport.
Yeah, and he knew that by issuing these visas, he was saving a life.
So for my family, this is really our heirloom of my aunts and uncles' sojourn in Shanghai. This is, as far as we know, their Chinese marriage documents. So my name is Daniel Yalkut. I'm the rabbi of Polei Tzedek in the Squirrel Hill section of Pittsburgh. My great-grandparents, Jakob and Simone, built their family in Berlin. All of their children survived in different ways. 2 boys made it to the United States in the early 30s. There were 2 children who made it to what was at that time British-controlled Palestine. In 1938, after Kristallnacht, all of the Jews of Eastern European descent were expelled from Germany. My grandmother, with her parents, went to Poland. My great-grandparents were shot by the Nazis. My grandmother actually got married in the ghetto to my grandfather in July of 1942, and they survived as employees of Oskar Schindler. But the story is about my great-uncle and his wife, my great-aunt, Hi and Rita Wind. So my Uncle Hi was able to get a visa to go in what, in certain ways would be the most surprising direction, that they rode out the war for upwards of 6 or 7 years in Shanghai. And that's actually where they married. They knew each other back in Berlin. She knew the family. And she, with her parents, and my great-uncle by himself were in Shanghai, and they got married together in the ghetto. So when my great-aunt passed on, her husband predeceased her by about 20 years, we actually have their Chinese marriage document that hangs in a prominent place in our dining room. We kind of have kept that as a memorial to that part of our family history. And it's very important to my wife and to myself that our children have this sense of where they come from. The idea that both the calamity that befell the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust, but also kind of the remarkable and miraculous story of revival that came from there.
And I'm 14 years old. It never occurred to me that my father had a story. I knew there was a Holocaust, and my father's parents were killed, but that's all I knew, and his brother was killed. My father was a Holocaust survivor who managed to escape through Shanghai. My father was 17 years old when the war broke out in Poland. So my father was born in Poland, grew up in Warsaw, the son of a Hasidic family. September 1st, 1939, the Germans attacked Poland. According to my father, every able-bodied Polish male from the age of 17 to 50 was drafted into the Polish army. He was given 24 hours of basic training. And then he was sent to the front. The Panthers attacked. Their lines broke immediately. He escaped. My father went to rejoin his unit. They decided that they were going to do sort of hit and run stuff against the Germans. It turns out they had an informer in their midst, and they were taken to a prisoner of war camp. He started his escape on the second day of Sukkot in 1939, but he had to make his way back to Warsaw, because that's where his family was. Leaving Warsaw with no papers, he just went to any train that was going to any neutral country. The first one that he could get on was to Riga, Latvia. And then the next part was going to Kovno, Kaunas in Lithuania. They weren't going to Shanghai. They were supposed to go to Macau or to one of the Caribbean islands. So the way you got there was to go through Japan. My father got to Japan with 110, 120 other guys in the hold of a Japanese fishing trawler. They got caught in a typhoon. A Japanese Coast Guard cutter. They brought them to Yokohama, let the Jewish community in Kobe know that they were still alive. So that's where they were. And so I'm gonna say from February, March, something like that, 1940, till May, April 1941, the Mir Yeshiva was 2 weeks ahead of them. The Mir Yeshiva was the preeminent advanced school of Talmud learning, Talmud study, and rabbinical academy in Europe at the time. It was the equivalent In Judaism, it would be the equivalent of Harvard. Somewhere in February, March, the leaders of the Jewish community were told that they received an order that the Jewish community was going to be moved from Kobe to Shanghai. When he got to Shanghai in 41, they were taken to what was the Jewish quarter. They were just dumped. Literally just dumped there. Fend for yourselves. My father found a room, and he had to make a living. The Mir Yeshiva, they needed Chalav Yisrael, kosher milk. In Judaism, one is enjoined from having milk from any animal that is not kosher. The main ones that we have are kosher animals that are domesticated, are sheep, goats, and cows. My father offered to them to start a milk business so that he could make a living. He had to get a special permit from the Japanese authorities to be able to leave early in the morning. Through contacts, he found a Chinese farmer who was willing to sell him just cow's milk. Father said he had a 50-gallon jug on handlebars of a bicycle. And he used to get up at 3:30 in the morning, and he had this permit to be able to leave. When the winter came, it was horrendous, because he was one of the few people that actually had a source of income. People starved to death. He said people were in the ghetto. You were walking, literally walking over frozen bodies in the street. But he managed to stay healthy. He said the greatest day in Shanghai was VJ Day. When the announcement came over that the Japanese had been vanquished and surrendered, they were all still poor as hell and starving. Many people were starving, but they didn't care. And then the doors were thrown open. They could leave. What he said was, I want to go where my family is. We know that they were killed in Auschwitz in 1943. His mother's brother had come to the United States in the 1920s to New York City. He was 24 when he came to the United States. Everybody else was dead. I think it took about a month, and then he found a job, and through that job he met my mother. My father started to tell the story. The story that I heard the first time was seared into my brain. It was his refuge because it was a place that he felt semi-safe, that he could get out of once a week and had the ability to earn a living that benefited him, his friends, and the Rabbinical Academy, the Mir Yeshiva. Shanghai was his refuge and his torture at the same time.
Lucy Hartwich was my aunt. During the war, she was one of the lucky ones that managed to get out with her husband and to Shanghai. You remember the Kristallnacht, Crystal Night. On the morning of the 9th or 10th, I don't remember, our phone rang very early in the morning, and Lucy said, "Don't you know what's going on in the streets? They're smashing all the Jewish stores' windows, and they're hauling Jewish men well, we don't know where to, actually." And at the end, Lucy said, "I'm going to try and find a place to emigrate to." And she managed to get passage to Shanghai. She had had a school for Jewish children in Berlin, because at a certain point before Kristallnacht, Jewish children couldn't go to public schools, and Jewish teachers couldn't teach. On the ship which carried them to the Far East were many, many of her students from Berlin with their families. Lucy realized that the people, hardly anybody knew good enough English to find a job when they got to the other end. So she went to the captain of the ship and she said, "Will you let me have your dining rooms when you don't need them?" And the captain said, "Well, what are you going to do with the dining rooms?" And she said, "I'm going to have everybody speaking English." On the ship was a very wealthy man by the name of Horace Kaduri. The Kaduri family is a very famous family of philanthropists and people who helped save many Jews. And Horace Kaduri was very interested in this woman, what she was doing. When they were about a week or so out of Shanghai, he said to Mrs. Artwich, "There are already many hundreds, if not thousands, of Jewish refugees in Shanghai, and the children need an education." And he said, "We will need to have a school for those children, and I'm going to provide the school, and you will head the school when we get to the other end."
Life at the Kaduri School was, for me, one of the most important things of Shanghai. It gave me the education I had, and I always say I most probably would have grown up illiterate if it wouldn't have been for that.
People were able to communicate, but here for the first time, they learned a common language, English. And that's, I think, was a very important part of the Kaduri School.
She was a great educator. Everybody says that. You know, she had a calling. She really had a calling. I look at it and I think about all the upheaval that they faced. My mother and her aunts and her own mother, they all went to ends of the earth, you know, before there was the internet and before you knew what was there. They were just, you know, getting on a boat and having no idea what they faced at the other end.
Everybody who is in the audience, please use the Q&A to put in your own questions. We already have one that is very good, and I look forward to getting to it. Anyone who needs to take a moment, that was so beautifully done and very emotional. And the caption at the end that there's this story of hope. Some of my students are on this program, and they know that I'm always looking for these spots of light in stories of the Holocaust. So I'm so grateful to you for bringing a story like this to us tonight. Let me tell people about you, and then we'll get down to the discussion. Um, Iris Samson is a local filmmaker and TV producer working primarily for WQED TV. A 5-time Mid-Atlantic Emmy Award winner, Iris has also won 9 Golden Quill Awards, the Robert Vann Award for Best Documentary, and 3 Pennsylvania Association of Broadcaster Awards for Best Documentary. Her most recent Emmy came for the film that we just watched, and we can see why. She just finished a stint as co-producer on the 1-hour national PBS special Harbor from the Holocaust, which aired this past September and is still being screened all around the country. Her husband's family includes many Holocaust survivors, including 3 uncles and an aunt who survived by fleeing to Shanghai. Iris also produced a 2-volume set of 18 local survivor stories for the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh and is the former assistant editor of the Jewish Chronicle. And thank you. I'm so happy that you're with us and we can talk about this. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. And Jacob's story was so fascinating. We could have done a documentary just on that.
Maybe we will. It's not too late.
It's never too late.
And I mean, we could see the power of just bringing these stories to life. And I was also so moved to see Margaret Diamond of blessed memory interviewed there, telling her family's story, her aunt's story. Okay, so I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'm going to, I think, alternate between my questions and the Q&A. And as the Q&A fills, I'm going to give that over to the audience. So my first question, sure. Iris, you've been sharing stories of the Holocaust for years. For example, our testimony project, which I mentioned in my brief intro. Can you talk about your connection to the subject matter? What draws you to this subject matter?
Well, in college, I actually minored in Jewish history and was always interested in that. And after a trip to Israel, I decided I wanted to work in the Jewish world. And my first job out of college was working for AIPAC, which is a Jewish organization. Then I went to work for B'nai B'rith International in Washington, D.C. And when I moved here to Pittsburgh, when I got married, my first job was with the Jewish Chronicle of Pittsburgh. So it sort of was a natural entree into doing stories about the Jewish world. And then having had, my mother-in-law was a Holocaust survivor from Poland, and that just made it that much more interesting for me and more compelling because my kids are grandchildren of a survivor. So I think that really spurred that for me.
And that's part of the story that we're telling tonight, is the story of generations, right? Preserving the memories. And I really, I enjoyed seeing the objects and the photographs and the things that people brought with them from Shanghai. And we think about artifacts and collections. We're thinking how lucky we are that these things have survived and are documentation of what happened. So from the Q&A first, I have bravo, bravo, thank you. It's not a question, but I wanted to share with you. That's
thank
the feedback. And then this question, it reads, I'm quoting, I noticed the caption during the discussion between Feng Shanho's granddaughter and great-granddaughter said Murraysville. Do either of them live here? That's the first part.
Well, so his granddaughter is a woman named Betty Ho Carlson, who actually was a volunteer at the Holocaust Center for a number of years. And she lives in Murraysville. And as we started doing the national documentary, several years before, when I did the 18 Holocaust stories for you guys, we did a story on Betty because it's such a fascinating story. He was called the Chinese Schindler. And it was a story that I had never heard before. And this was a number of years ago. I think this was probably a good 10 years ago. And when we started talking about doing the national documentary, of course it came up because so few people really knew the story of Feng Shanho. And then the fact that we had this wonderful Pittsburgh connection just made it all the more special for us to be able to tell that story.
And then this question also asks about what other artifacts are part of the Holocaust Center's collection. So I'll take that and answer. People who have visited us in the past have seen the Friedman collection of artifacts from the Holocaust in France. We also have a number of passports in our collection, including some that are stamped for Shanghai. So when we display the Torah, we'll also be able to show those. And we have a handful of other things, and actually more than that, but what we'll display will be probably 20 or so artifacts, and we would love to open that display to visitors early in the new year, I'll say. And that is at Chatham University in the library. And perhaps a future program, we will talk more about what we have in our collection.
Just a little bit of information for you. So Harry Weinblum, who was the first person that we interviewed, has a tremendous collection. He's got Shanghai Chronicles. He's got playbills from that area. And I spoke with the people at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum about him donating his collection, but you should get to him before he gives it to them.
Thank you for the tip. I'm going to follow up on that. Well, especially, I mean, now that we're able to show the Torah and build an exhibit around it to give more context, I'm really glad to know that. Thank you for sharing that. When did you learn about the story of Shanghai? What made you interested in telling the story?
Everything is beshert, as we would say. My husband and I were, I worked for QED off and on since 2005, when actually I went with Edie Neve from the Holocaust Center and a bunch of teachers to Poland. We did Pittsburgh to Poland, and WQED did a 1-hour documentary about it. And that sort of launched my career with them. So anyway, that's partially how I got interested. That's my involvement with QED. And then I get a call from the vice president of programming at the time, Daryl Ford Williams, who said, would you be interested in working on a documentary, doing some archival research for me? It's about Jews and Shanghai. And I said, my husband has 3 uncles that actually survived the war by being in Shanghai. So, it's a Jewish world. Everything is sort of connected. I said, how could I not work on the documentary? So that's initially how I got started. And I knew nothing about really the story of the Jews of Shanghai. And it was really an eye-opener and actually a very positive story. So it was very different than the other Holocaust stories that I've done in the past. It was nice to have a story that has not a happy ending, but a positive ending.
And I was thinking about the positive aspects of this story. I mean, survival and rescue, the best of humanity at a time where we really see the worst of humanity. We have a question that it follows directly on what you just said, and I'll quote. Okay. I've studied World War II and the Holocaust since I was young, but knew so little of this aspect. So I really appreciate being introduced to it, but curious if you have a theory on why this is not a story that is widely known.
Well, actually, we kind of went back and forth with that. We worked with the scholars at University of Pittsburgh. And one of the things that they thought was because of the politics in China, there was a long time where the story wasn't told. But as China has become more interested in having relations with the Western world, they want to promote this story because here's the story of China that actually everybody else had their doors closed, nearly everybody, to Jewish refugees at that time. But China was one of the few places that they could actually get in. So it's to their benefit to tell the story, but it's also a phenomenal story.
And we have a second comment in the Q&A saying the same thing, that he never heard this before, and why not? And I think that your answer is really, I'll admit that I have been aware of this for many years and never thought of a time when we weren't aware of it, but of course it's not the story that we hear. And we do tend to hear a limited scope of the hundreds of thousands of stories from this era.
Right. And they said, to be honest, they suffered. It was not an easy life for the Jews that ended up there, but they were helped by a Jewish community that already existed. I know a lot of people don't even know about the Jewish communities that already were there in Shanghai, that were there to open their arms for the refugees as they flowed in from Germany and from Austria and from Eastern Europe. So it's really a fascinating story.
And part of the Jewish world that we don't really think very much about because we tend to be so focused on the West in the United States. These are the stories that we tell.
Right. Just as an aside, and since we were just talking about it, so there were actually the Jews that were in Shanghai were Baghdadi Jews. and they were involved in the opium trade. And then you had the Russian Jews that had come there after the Russian Revolution. They were fleeing, and there was a Russian Jewish community. So when the Eastern European Jews came, they were like a whole new group that was added to that mix. And though the communities didn't mix as much as you would think, the Baghdadi Jews, because they were phenomenally wealthy, were able to at least provide homes. You know, those, you saw the picture of the like mass homes that the refugees were living in. So, and it's also a story of how the Joint Distribution Committee and the American Joint Distribution Committee came in, and they poured money into Shanghai to try to help refugees. So it's really a wonderful, positive story.
It's an incredible story, and I'm glad that we're talking about it. And I can see from the questions that it really is a new story for a lot of people. So I'm so glad that we're able to bring it to them. Please put more questions in the Q&A if you have them. We have time for a couple more. So I'm wondering, Iris, what is the most challenging part of creating these documentaries?
Well, and I'm sure you feel the same way. Our biggest and saddest problem was trying to get the survivors themselves. So for example, Peter Max, a very famous artist, pop artist from the 1960s and 70s, was a Shanghai lander. He grew up in Shanghai. He was a child in Shanghai. He learned art in Shanghai. By the time we got to him, he wasn't healthy enough to be interviewed. So our struggle was finding these people, getting to them as quickly as we possibly could, and getting their stories on tape, on film, because, you know, once they're gone, so many of these stories are really going to be lost.
Right. And what is the most rewarding part?
I think being able to tell their stories, you know, because these especially, we were very lucky, and the story of the Jews in Shanghai, though, like I said before, it was a very tough life. It was also such a wonderful thing that whole families survived, you know, and they had no idea what was going on in Europe. And I know that their life was very difficult, but the fact that there was a place where there was a haven, they weren't hounded because they were Jews. It wasn't great living under the Japanese, but they basically were pretty much left alone. You know, they could almost not say that what happened almost anywhere else, because even in America, we were facing a lot of anti-Semitism, but there wasn't a lot of anti-Semitism in China, and that was really a good thing.
So we have one more question, and maybe we have a couple more. And this question I want to ask you comes from a friend of mine in Texas I haven't seen in many years. This is the power of Zoom, right? Is there any more information about what moved Feng Shanho to sign the visas? His granddaughter explained he thought it was something anyone would do. Are there any letters or other materials to fill out his perspective at the time?
So Feng Shanho has a daughter named Manly Ho. She's based out of San Francisco, and she loves to tell the story of her father because, you know, as would be expected, the Chinese were very upset with him that he was issuing all these visas, and his diplomatic career really took a hit after he started issuing these visas. They sent him back to China. And the story really didn't come out until the 1990s about him, you know, saving thousands and thousands of Jews. And so if your friend wants to learn more, look up Manly Ho, and she loves to tell the story. We have her in the 1-hour documentary, but I'm also feel very privileged that we have his granddaughter right here in Pittsburgh.
Wonderful. And I'm just typing that in response to the question that came in so that will be available.
Great.
Okay, we have one more.
Okay, I'll try.
Oh my goodness, we have two more. Okay, well, these we can do. Okay, there's a very nice Jewish museum in Shanghai built around two of the synagogues. There's also a very good book about the time, The Song of the Jade Lily. So that's not a question, that's someone sharing with everybody in the audience. Iris, were you able to visit?
Well, actually, this is like, again, everything is bashert, as we would say. How many years ago? My family and I went to China. And when? 2007. In 2007, we went to China. We went to Shanghai, and we actually visited what at that time was a very small little museum. It has since become this beautiful big museum. And if anybody goes to China, I would recommend that you all go to the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum and check it out, because it's got beautiful artifacts. It's got a wedding dress that was made out of a parachute. It's got all kinds of neat things, but it's got the wall where they put about 13,000 names of the people that lived in the ghetto, that survived there. Not everybody was, obviously, because it was over 18,000. We think maybe even closer to 20,000 Jews that came out of there. But you can go there, you can see these names, and you see how real it was.
So this is going to be the concluding question, because it ties it up nicely. Is Fen Shan Ho recognized by Yad Vashem as a righteous Gentile?
Yes. And in fact, a number of years ago, they had a big ceremony in his birth town in China, where they recognized him, and they had beautiful banners, and they actually finally gave him the credit that really he well deserved. He didn't ask for the recognition. He didn't tell the story really for many, many years. He did write a book, which your friend should also look up, where he talked very little about it. But he did the right thing at a time when so many people didn't. And thank God, Yad Vashem did recognize him, but so did other people. And I think that's really important.
And how often do we hear rescuers say, I did what anyone would have done, right? When we know, of course, I mean, if everyone had done that, we would have a very different story to tell.
Absolutely.
Iris, I want to congratulate you on winning that Emmy for, it's a beautiful, I mean, I really had to collect myself before I could come back and ask you questions. It's so moving.
Well, thank
you so very much. And to the Weinblum family, thank you again. And Marilyn, for sitting down to talk to me a little bit more about Jack Weinblum. And to everyone who joined us, thank you for coming tonight to remember the pogrom of November 1938 and to hear some stories. I mean, these are the stories that keep the memory alive. So I bid you all good night, and thank you again, Iris. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.